We do not know, when we begin a story like this one, how heavy a roof of packed earth and prairie grass can become when the sky finally decides to empty itself upon it. But by the time our story ends, you will understand it as well as anyone who ever lived through a Nebraska winter. Ruth Callahan was 43 years old and had exactly $14 to her name when her husband's own brother stood in the doorway of the farmhouse she had scrubbed and loved for 11 years and told her she was no longer welcome beneath its roof. He was Nathaniel Callahan, and his reason was simple and legal and utterly without mercy. The claim had been filed in his name alone, a technicality from years before that Thomas had always meant to correct and never did before the fever took him. With that $14, a trunk of clothes, and a grief she had not yet found time to feel, Ruth walked into the town of Sparrow Hollow, and, within the week, spent $6 of those dollars on an abandoned sod house on the northern edge of the county, a crumbling, overgrown claim that everyone agreed was worthless. Built years earlier by a strange German homesteader named Otto Voss, who had vanished without explanation and left behind a roof so thick and so oddly constructed that the men of Sparrow Hollow laughed when they heard what she'd done, calling it a fool's purchase, a grave she'd dug for herself before winter ever arrived. But what none of them knew, what even Ruth herself did not yet know, was that Otto Voss had built that roof heavy for a reason far more important than keeping out the cold, and that the secret packed into its layers of earth and grass would, before the year was through, save more than just one widow's life. It would restore an entire town to what had been stolen from it. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Ruth Callahan. If you are watching this from a place that has been written off by everyone around you, a place folks call worthless or foolish or beyond saving, we hope you'll tell us about it in the comments, because this story is for you. Ruth had not always been a woman who counted dollars. She had grown up the daughter of a stonemason in Ohio, in a house where her mother kept a garden so orderly that neighbors would walk out of their way just to see the rows of beans standing at attention like soldiers, and where her father taught her, almost by accident, the patient logic of things built to last. He used to say that any fool could stack stone into a wall, but it took a thinking person to stack stone into a wall that would still be standing after the person who built it was dust. Ruth had listened to him the way some children listen to bedtime stories, hungrily, and by the time she was 12 she could tell you why a keystone held an arch together, why a foundation needed to sit below the frost line, why the old barns in their county never seemed to fall even after 50 winters while the new ones, built quick and cheap, sagged and split within a decade. It was not knowledge anyone expected a girl to carry, and certainly not knowledge anyone expected her to need. But she carried it anyway, tucked away like a good coat kept for a colder day than the one she was presently living in. She met Thomas Callahan at a church supper when she was 22, a broad-shouldered, soft-spoken man who had come east briefly to visit cousins before returning to try his luck on a homestead claim in the Nebraska Territory, and something about the quiet certainty in his voice when he spoke of the prairie, the way he described the sky as bigger than any sky had a right to be. The grass moving in waves like a green ocean convinced her that she wanted to see it too, and more than that, she wanted to see it beside him. They married within the year and traveled west together, and for over a decade they built a life out of sod and sweat, and the kind of stubborn hope that either kills a person or makes them unbreakable. Ruth learned to make a home in a house with dirt walls and a dirt roof, and she came, in time, to love it in a way that surprised her. The way the thick walls kept the house cool in the brutal heat of July and held warmth through the bitter nights of January. The way the whole structure seemed less like a building and more like something borrowed from the earth itself and given back to it, gently, when the family eventually moved on. She and Thomas never had children who lived past their first winters, a grief she folded quietly into the deepest part of herself and rarely spoke of. But they had each other, and they had the farm, and for 11 years that had been enough. Thomas's brother Nathaniel was a different sort of man entirely, restless and resentful, the kind of person who measured his own worth by comparing it against what his brother had built, and finding himself always coming up short. He had drifted in and out of Sparrow Hollow over the years, borrowing money he rarely repaid, disappearing for months at a stretch, and Ruth had never much cared for him, though she had been civil, because Thomas asked it of her, and because civility cost her nothing. When the fever swept through the county in the spring of 1881, and took Thomas within 9 days. It was Nathaniel who arrived at the funeral with a lawyer from the county seat already in tow, a thin, nervous man who produced a document showing that the original claim, filed a decade earlier during a brief period when Thomas had been called away and asked his younger brother to handle the paperwork, had never been properly transferred. It had sat, all those years, in Nathaniel's name, a forgotten technicality that Thomas had always intended to fix and never had, trusting, as good men often do, that blood would count for more than ink. Ruth stood at her husband's grave and listened to a stranger explain to her, in the gentlest voice he could manage, that the farm she had built with her own 2 hands for over a decade was not, and had never legally been, hers to keep. She was given 2 weeks to gather her belongings. She spent the first several days in a fog so thick she could barely recall eating, but on the 3rd night, she sat at the kitchen table, a table Thomas had built from cottonwood the 2nd summer they were married, and made herself do the arithmetic her father had once done with stone. What do I have? What can I still build with it? The answer, when she finally faced it, was $14, a trunk of clothes, a few tools that had belonged to her, a Bible, and a body that still, despite everything, knew how to work. She did not weep in front of Nathaniel again after that first night, and this, more than anything, seemed to unsettle him, as though he had expected her collapse and found her steadiness far more difficult to live with than her grief would have been. Sparrow Hollow in the autumn of 1881 was a modest county seat town of perhaps 400 souls, its main street lined with a mercantile, a bank, a church with a steeple visible for miles across the flat land, and a scattering of houses built by families who had, in most cases, arrived with less than Ruth now possessed, and turned it, slowly and with considerable suffering, into something like prosperity. She took a room above the mercantile for 2 of her $14 and spent the following days walking the town, asking after work, and hearing, more often than she would have liked, the particular tone people use when they are sorry for a woman but not sorry enough to actually help her. It was in the office of the county land agent, a narrow, well-appointed room that smelled of pipe tobacco and new paper, that she first heard about the Voss claim. The land agent was a smooth, prosperous-looking man named Silas Pruitt, who had held his position for 6 years and had, in that time, become one of the wealthiest men in the county, a fact that struck Ruth as faintly strange given that land agents were not, as a rule, meant to grow rich off the poverty of homesteaders. Pruitt mentioned the Voss claim almost as a joke, a curiosity to break the tedium of refusing her request for work as a clerk. Old Otto Voss, he explained, had filed on 160 acres 8 years back. A queer, solitary German who kept to himself, spoke little English, and disappeared one autumn without warning or explanation, leaving behind an unusually elaborate sod house that no one in town had ever wanted on account of its roof. Built it too heavy, Pruitt said, leaning back in his chair with the satisfied air of a man delivering a punchline. Piled sod on that roof 3 times thicker than any sensible man would bother with, packed it down with willow lattice and buffalo hide besides, like he was building a fortress instead of a house. Folks used to say he must have been simple in the head, wasting all that labor on a roof heavy enough to bring the whole structure down on its own foundation before winter even got started. Banks held the claim in forfeiture for taxes these 5 years. You could have it for $6 and be doing us a favor hauling away an eyesore. Ruth asked to see it before she gave him an answer, and Pruitt, amused, arranged for a boy to drive her out the following morning. The Voss claim sat nearly 4 miles north of town, on a stretch of land slightly higher than its neighbors, with a shallow creek running along its western edge and a scattering of chokecherry bushes gone wild and thick around what had once, clearly, been a garden. The house itself, when Ruth first laid eyes on it, took her breath in a way she had not expected. It was larger than the sod houses she had grown accustomed to, its walls thick and precisely cut, its single door hung with more care than most homesteaders bothered to invest, and above it all sat a roof so heavy with earth and grass that it seemed, at first glance, to sag under its own weight, though when she walked closer and studied the ridge line, she saw that it did not sag at all. It held, impossibly level, the way a well-built arch holds a weight that should by all rights crush it. She stood there a long while, in the cold autumn wind, remembering her father's voice explaining keystones to a girl of 12, and she understood, with a certainty she could not have explained to Pruitt or anyone else in Sparrow Hollow, that whoever had built that roof had not been simple in the head at all. He had known exactly what he was doing. The only question, and it nagged at her the whole ride back to town, was why a man would go to such trouble, at such cost in labor and material, to build a roof no ordinary house required. She bought the claim the next morning for $6, leaving her with 8, and by that evening half of Sparrow Hollow knew of it, and found it a fine thing to laugh about over supper. The house needed less repair than Ruth expected, which surprised her, given how long it had stood empty. The door hung true. The single window, its glass miraculously unbroken, still let in a clean rectangle of afternoon light. Mice had gotten into the floor in places, and she spent her first days sweeping out years of dust and dried grass and the husks of insects long dead, patching the earthen floor where it had crumbled, scrubbing the small hearth until it would draw a fire cleanly again. She slept, that first night, on a pallet of blankets beneath a roof that 8 men in town had told her, in various tones of pity and amusement, would likely come down on her head before the first snow. It was on her 4th day in the house, while running her hand along the inside of the roof beam nearest the door to check for rot, that she first noticed something odd. The willow lattice that formed the underlying structure of the roof, the skeleton, so to speak, over which the sod itself had been laid, had been built with an unusual number of small recessed pockets along its length, each one packed carefully with a layer of dried clay before the sod above it had been set in place. It was not, she understood immediately, an accident of construction. It was deliberate. Someone had built hiding places into the very bones of the roof, and then buried a house on top of them. Her first thought, foolish as it seemed even to her, was that Otto Voss had hidden money. Homesteaders distrusted banks with good reason, and a man alone on the prairie, far from town, might well have preferred to keep his savings close and hidden rather than trust them to Silas Pruitt's institution. But when she finally worked her fingers into the nearest pocket and drew out a small, tightly wrapped bundle of oiled canvas, what she found inside was not coin at all, not at first. It was a letter written in a careful, cramped hand, in German, dated some 9 years earlier, folded around a single gold coin and a smaller scrap of paper covered in numbers and symbols she did not immediately understand. Figures, columns, dates, the beginnings of what looked, to her increasingly uneasy eye, like some kind of ledger. She could not read the German, and there was no one in Sparrow Hollow she trusted enough yet to ask, and so she wrapped the bundle carefully back in its canvas and sat that evening by her small fire, turning the single gold coin over and over in her fingers, feeling, for the first time since Thomas's death, the particular electric quiet of a person standing at the edge of something far larger than herself. Over the following 2 weeks, working carefully and without hurry, for the roof had waited 9 years and would wait a little longer, Ruth located and removed 11 more of the hidden pockets, each containing similar bundles, several more gold coins, a handful of silver dollars, a small worn photograph of a young woman Ruth did not recognize, and, most significantly, page after page of the same cramped ledger figures, along with a second, longer letter, also in German, that appeared to have been written some months after the first, in a hand grown visibly shakier and more urgent. It took her nearly a month to find someone she trusted to translate them, a decision she did not make lightly, for she understood, even before she knew what the letters contained, that whatever Otto Voss had hidden in his roof had likely been hidden for a reason connected to danger, not merely privacy. She settled finally on the town's schoolteacher, a soft-spoken widow named Elsa Brandt who had come from Bavaria as a girl and still read her father's old books in German by lamplight, and who Ruth judged, correctly, to be discreet, intelligent, and entirely without loyalty to Silas Pruitt. Elsa read the first letter slowly, her lips moving faintly as she worked through the old-fashioned phrasing, and as she read, her expression changed from polite curiosity to something graver, something Ruth recognized because she had felt its early cousin the moment she first found the pockets in the roof. Otto Voss, the letters explained, had not been the simple, harmless eccentric that Sparrow Hollow remembered. He had been a surveyor by training in the old country, and after filing his claim, he had noticed, in the course of ordinary work helping neighboring homesteaders establish their boundary lines. A pattern of small but consistent irregularities in the official land office records, irregularities that, taken individually, might have passed for careless clerking, but that, taken together, revealed something far more deliberate. Water rights along the creek that fed nearly a dozen homesteads north and west of town had been quietly reassigned, on paper, away from the homesteaders who had settled and improved the land, and toward a holding company whose ownership, when Voss traced it through county records with the patient thoroughness of his old profession, led back, through two deliberately obscure intermediaries, to Silas Pruitt himself. Pruitt, it appeared, had been diverting water rights for years, starving certain homesteads of the creek access their crops depended on, driving families to abandon claims he could then acquire cheaply through tax forfeiture, all while quietly selling the consolidated water rights to a railroad survey company planning a branch line through the county, a line that would make the land Pruitt controlled worth many times what he had paid for it. Voss had documented all of it, meticulously, in the pages Ruth now held, and in his second letter, the shakier one, he explained that he had confronted Pruitt directly, hoping, foolishly, he admitted, in hindsight, to shame the man into reversing the fraud quietly rather than see it exposed. Instead, within a fortnight, Voss had received threats serious enough that he judged it wiser to hide his evidence somewhere it would not be found by a casual search, and to leave the county until whatever danger he sensed had passed. He had built his hiding place into the very structure of his roof, reasoning, with the strange logic of a frightened but careful man, that no one searching a house looks up, and that a roof heavy and strange enough to be mocked and avoided by the entire town was, in its own way, the safest vault a man could build. He had intended to return. The letters made that much plain. But Otto Voss never came back to Sparrow Hollow, and no one, in the 9 years since, had ever learned what became of him. Ruth sat with Elsa Brandt long into that night, the two women reading and rereading the translated pages by lamplight. And when she finally walked home alone across 4 miles of dark prairie to the house everyone still called foolish, she understood, with a clarity that felt almost frightening, that she was no longer merely a widow trying to survive the winter. She was the only person left alive who knew the truth about what had happened to a dozen ruined homesteads, and about the man who had ruined them. She did not act rashly. She had learned patience the hard way, in the 11 years since her marriage and the 11 weeks since her husband's death, and she understood that a woman with $6 and no standing in Sparrow Hollow could not simply walk into the land office and accuse its most powerful man of fraud, without proof so complete it could not be dismissed. She spent the following weeks quietly, gathering what corroboration she could, visiting, under the pretense of neighborly kindness, the families whose water rights the ledger named, listening to their stories of crops failed for no reason anyone could explain, of creek water that seemed to run lower on their land than it had any right to, of small forced sales that had, over the years, enlarged Pruitt's holdings acre by patient acre. She cross-referenced dates and names against Voss's ledger with Elsa's help, and slowly, carefully, a case built itself, page by page, in a tin box she kept hidden, appropriately enough, in her own roof. It was inevitable, in a town as small as Sparrow Hollow, that word would eventually reach Silas Pruitt that the widow living in the old Voss claim had been asking unusual questions and visiting unusual houses, and by the time the first hard frost of November settled over the county, Ruth understood that she was being watched. Pruitt came to her himself, on a gray afternoon in late November, arriving in a fine buggy that looked almost comically out of place beside her humble sod house, and he was, at first, all courtesy, complimenting her improvements to the property, expressing concern for a woman alone facing a prairie winter, and offering, with the smooth generosity of a man accustomed to buying his way out of problems, to purchase the claim back from her for $50, nearly 10 times what she had paid. Ruth thanked him for his concern and declined, and watched something shift behind his eyes, the courtesy thinning like ice over a moving creek. He returned twice more over the following weeks, each time with a higher offer and a thinner patience, and on his third visit he abandoned pretense altogether, informing her plainly that a woman alone, without male protection, without standing, without friends of consequence in the county, would find the coming winter considerably harder than she imagined, and that certain debts and certain permits and certain small legal technicalities had a way of becoming very inconvenient for people who made themselves difficult. Ruth listened to all of it standing in her own doorway. Beneath the roof he did not know held the proof of everything he had built his fortune upon, and she told him, in a voice she was rather proud of afterward for its steadiness, that she had survived worse than his threats and intended to survive this too. He left angry, and the following week, the bank quietly called in a small debt from the mercantile owner who had been selling Ruth flour and coffee on credit, and Elsa Brandt found herself informed, with great regret, that the town could no longer justify her teaching position given certain budget concerns, and Ruth understood that Pruitt had begun, patiently, and without ever raising his voice, to make good on his threat by starving out everyone connected to her. It was into this tightening circumstance that the blizzard arrived, in the second week of December, with a suddenness that even the oldest residents of Sparrow Hollow would later describe as unlike anything they had witnessed. The sky had been merely gray and cold in the morning, the wind unremarkable, and by early afternoon the temperature had fallen so sharply and the snow had begun to move so fast and so thick across the flat land that men caught out checking fences barely made it back to their own doors. It snowed for the better part of 2 days without meaningful pause, and the wind, when it came, drove that snow into drifts that reshaped the entire landscape, burying fence lines, burying wagons, burying, in 3 separate cases across the county, small outbuildings whose roofs simply could not bear the accumulated weight and collapsed inward under the strain. Ruth spent the storm largely alone in her house, feeding her small fire, listening to the wind scream past walls 3 feet thick, and it was on the second night, when the worst of the storm was at its peak, that she heard, faint through the howling, a sound that made her blood run cold, a family's voice, calling, somewhere out in the white chaos, and she understood, with the same instinct that had once made her father speak of keystones and foundations, that someone was lost and freezing within earshot of her door. She found them by following her own porch rail out into the blinding snow with a length of rope tied around her waist and anchored to the door frame. A young farming family named the Hollisters, husband, wife, and 2 small children, who had been trying to reach town when their wagon became hopelessly mired and their horse went lame in the drifts, and who would very likely have frozen to death within the hour had Ruth's house not stood, lit and solid, directly in their desperate path. She brought all 4 of them inside, wrapped them in every blanket she owned, fed them what little she had, and the 5 of them spent the remainder of that terrible night together beneath a roof that groaned and shifted under a snowdrift that had, by the storm's end, piled itself against the northern wall to a depth of nearly 8 feet. Elsewhere in the county, that same night, 3 roofs came down. The livery stable in town collapsed entirely, killing 2 horses and narrowly missing a stable hand asleep in the loft. A neighboring family soddy caved in along its ridge beam, forcing them out into the storm itself, where they survived only by the good fortune of a nearby cellar. And the church steeple, visible for miles in fair weather, twisted and fell under the combined weight of ice and wind, a sight that shook the whole town when the storm finally cleared and people emerged to survey the damage. Ruth Callahan's roof, the one every man in Sparrow Hollow had confidently predicted would collapse before the first hard snow, held an 8-foot drift without so much as a visible strain, sheltering not only its rightful owner, but 4 strangers who would otherwise have died in the open prairie that night. When the storm broke and the sky cleared to a hard, bright blue, and the Hollister family made their tearful way home to a community that had, over the following days, begun to piece together the scale of the disaster, the story of the widow's sod house, the one everyone had mocked, the one built too heavy, too strange, too foolish to survive, spread through Sparrow Hollow with the particular speed that only a true and remarkable thing can travel. Men who had laughed at Ruth Callahan in October found themselves, in December, standing in her dooryard studying the construction of her roof with genuine and humbled curiosity, asking how it was built, why it had held when far newer structures had failed, and Ruth, standing in the aftermath of the storm that had nearly killed a young family and had instead saved them, understood that the moment had come to finish what Otto Voss had started 9 years before. She did not go to Silas Pruitt. She went instead to the county judge, a stern, deliberate man named Everett Marsh who had a reputation for honesty that even Pruitt's money had never quite managed to purchase. And she brought with her the tin box from her roof, Voss's ledgers, his letters, translated and notarized by Elsa Brandt, the corroborating accounts of a dozen families whose water rights had been quietly stolen, and the simple, damning arithmetic of dates and land transfers that Voss had assembled at what had likely cost him everything. Judge Marsh read through the evidence over the course of 2 full days, sent quiet inquiries to the Territorial Land Office, and by the second week of January, Silas Pruitt found himself summoned before a formal county inquiry, stripped, within a month, of his position as land agent, and facing charges of fraud serious enough that he left Sparrow Hollow before spring thaw and never returned. The water rights he had stolen were restored, by judicial order, to the homesteads Voss's ledger had named, and the small fortune Voss had hidden alongside his evidence, gold and silver enough to be significant, though never enough to be called a treasure in the way such stories sometimes promise, was, at Judge Marsh's suggestion and Ruth's own insistence, put toward rebuilding what the blizzard had destroyed, a new roof for the livery, timber and iron for a rebuilt church steeple, and relief. Enough to see the Hollister family and 2 others through the remainder of a hard winter. Of Otto Voss himself, no trace was ever found, though Judge Marsh's inquiries turned up a brief record of a man matching his description who had crossed into Canada some years before, and Ruth chose, in the end, to believe that he had lived, somewhere, long enough to know, even from a distance, that his patient and frightened labor had not been wasted. It is worth returning now to where we began, to a woman of 43 with $14, cast out by a brother-in-law's cold arithmetic, buying for $6 a house that an entire town had judged worthless and foolish. We told you then that something sealed within that roof would change her life and restore a community, and we hope you can see now how faithfully that promise was kept. Ruth Callahan did not set out to expose a fraud or rebuild a church steeple or save a young family from freezing in a blizzard. She set out, simply, to survive, using the only tools she had, patience, observation, and a stubborn refusal to dismiss a thing merely because everyone around her had already decided it was foolish. It was that same refusal, learned at her father's knee among stones, that outlasted the men who stacked them, that let her see a heavy, mocked, unwanted roof not as a grave, but as a shelter worth trusting, and it was that trust, in the end, that held an 8-foot drift of snow and, with it, held up an entire community's chance at justice. She lived in that sod house for the rest of her days, and though the town offered her, more than once, money enough to build something finer, she always declined, saying that she had grown fond of a roof that had proven, when it mattered most, to be exactly as strong as it looked foolish. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Ruth Callahan tonight. If her story moved you, we would be grateful if you would share it with someone who might need reminding that value is not always where the world expects to find it, and that the things everyone else has written off are sometimes exactly the things worth trusting. Before you go, we would love to know, has there ever been a moment in your own life when you found real worth in something others had already dismissed as foolish or beyond saving? Tell us in the comments below. We read every one, and we love hearing how these old stories echo in your own. Until next time, stay close.